In the previous video, or the previous section of the video, we looked at supply and demand separately. In this section, we'll look at them together. When a supply curve and a demand curve are graphed together, there are two types of points that are produced. The first type of point is produced as an equilibrium point. The word equilibrium means that a point or place where the two or more things are equal to each other. The equilibrium point is important because this is where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. The point produces two pieces of information for the economist. The first piece of information conveyed is the equilibrium price, which is conceptually the average price paid by consumers in a particular market. The second piece of information conveyed is the equilibrium quantity, which is conceptually the same as the average quantity of what people want. Economists sometimes refer to the equilibrium price as the market price, and the equilibrium quantity as the market quantity. The second type of points are points of disequilibrium. The word disequilibrium means a point or place where two or more things are not equal to each other. Where, in our case, this means that either the supply exceeds the demand or the demand exceeds the supply. The graph illustrates the concept of the equilibrium point. The demand curve is in blue and represents the demand for books. The red line represents the supply of goods. The point where the supply curve crosses the demand curve is the equilibrium point. If a line is drawn from the equilibrium point to the price axis, this will give us the equilibrium price or the market price. The equilibrium price of books is found by drawing a line from the equilibrium point to the price axis, which in our example is $3. So the equilibrium price of the book is $3 per book. If a line is drawn from the equilibrium point to the quantity axis, this gives us the equilibrium quantity or the market quantity. The equilibrium quantity of books is found by drawing a line straight down from the equilibrium point to the quantity axis, which in this example is 30 books. So the equilibrium quantity is 30 books. Thus, the graph tells us that the firm will sell and customers will demand 30 books at a price of $3 each. Here's a slightly different version of the graph with the supply and demand graph together. One of the obvious differences is this graph than the previous graphs. There are no numbers on the graph. One assumption that economists who created this is that the quantity increases as one moves from right to left. Similarly, the second assumption is of the economists who created the graph that the price increases as one moves from the bottom upward. The point of eliminating numbers is to allow the economists to focus in on the model and not get bogged down on the details of the numbers. So this type of graph allows us to focus on the visible model of supply and demand. The graph illustrates the concept of an equilibrium point. The demand curve for books is represented by the blue line, and the red line represents the supply of books. The point where the supply curve, the red line, crosses the demand curve, the blue line, is the equilibrium point. If a line is drawn from the equilibrium point to the price axis, this will give us the equilibrium price or market price. Since the economist doesn't know the exact numerical price, nor is he or she likely to care too much what it actually is, they would write P subscript E to designate the equilibrium price. If a line is drawn from the equilibrium point to the quantity axis, this will give us the equilibrium quantity or the market quantity. Since the economist doesn't know the exact numerical quantity here, and he or she is not likely to care too much, the economist will write Q subscript E to designate the equilibrium quantity. The second set of points are points of disequilibrium. The points of disequilibrium occur where either the supply exceeds the demand or the demand exceeds the supply. Disequilibrium points above the equilibrium price are points where the supply of goods exceeds the demand for goods. Disequilibrium points below the equilibrium price is where the demand for the good exceeds the supply of the good. Here's a slightly different version of the graph with the supply curve and the demand curve graphed together. One of the obvious differences between this graph and the previous graph is there are no numbers on the graph. One assumption of the economist who created this graph is that the quantity increases as one moves from right to left. Similarly, the second assumption of the economist who created the graph is that the price increases as one moves from the bottom upward. The point of eliminating the numbers is to allow the economist to focus on the model and not get too bogged down on the numbers. So this type of graph allows us to focus in on the visible model of supply and demand. Disequilibrium points are points where the supply of the good exceeds the demand for the good, or the demand for the good exceeds the supply. Disequilibrium points above the equilibrium price are points where the supply of good exceeds the demand for the good. Disequilibrium points below the equilibrium price are points where the demand for the good exceeds the supply of the good. Let's look at some distortions in the supply and demand. That is, let's look at some points of disequilibrium. There are two types of disequilibrium. A point of disequilibrium where the supply of a good exceeds the demand for a good is called a surplus. A point of disequilibrium where the demand for a good exceeds the supply of a good is called a shortage. Here's an example of a graph with a surplus. On the graph, the equilibrium price is $3 and the equilibrium quantity is 30 books. At $4, individuals will demand 20 books, and on the graph this is designated as Q sub D. At $4, firms will supply 40 books. On the graph this is designated as Q sub X. Since the amount of books that firms are willing to supply, 40, is greater than the amount of what individuals demand, 20, the supply of books exceeds the demand by customers, or there is a surplus of books at $4. While surpluses occur in the economy, economic theory argues that they will only exist temporarily, because if there is a surplus, firms will decrease the price of goods to encourage individuals to want more of it. Let's look at an example of a shortage using a graph. On the graph, the equilibrium price is $3 and the equilibrium quantity is 30 books. At $2, firms will supply 20 books. On the graph, this is designated as Q sub S. At $2, individuals will demand 40 books. On the graph, this is designated Q sub D. Since the amount of books that firms are willing to supply, 20, is lesser than what people demand, 40 books, the demand for books exceeds the supply of books, and there is a shortage of books at $2. While shortages do occur in the economy, economic theory argues that they will last only temporarily, because if there's a shortage, firms will increase the price of the good, causing some individuals to decide not to demand the good. Thus, the price is used to allocate a scarce good. Normally, surpluses and shortages happen only temporarily in economics, because there's an incentive for firms to change the prices of the products to encourage or discourage consumption of the good. However, government may intervene in the market for a particular good as a result of some social goal. For example, it may require to charge less than the market price for such goods as housing, with the idea of making individuals in the lowest income brackets have a place to live. Another example, government may cause the price of a good to remain high so that producers will continue to produce the product in case, and as in the case of payments to farmers, not to grow a particular crop. The two ways that the government can intervene in the supply and demand for our product is through price floors and price ceilings. A price floor occurs when the government sets the price of a good above the market price. Price floors create surpluses of the goods, and firms have no incentive to decrease the production of the good. Additionally, consumers are forced to pay a higher price for the good than they would if the market was determining the price of the good. Let's look at an example. Producers of books are only receiving $3 per book. The firms who are producing books would like to earn a little more money to cover their costs. As a result of pleas for assistance from the firms, the government sets the minimum price of books at $4 per book. As a result of setting the price of a book at $4, consumers now demand Q sub D, 20 books, but publishers will supply Q sub S, 40 books. As a result, there will be a surplus of books in this market, and books will sit on the shelves unused. A price ceiling occurs when the government sets the price of a good below the equilibrium price or the market price. The result of a price ceiling is a shortage. One of the important ramifications of a price ceiling is that firms have no incentive to increase production of their good to meet the demand for the good. Let's look at it as an example. Consumers of books are paying $3 per book, and they complain to the government that the price of books is too high and they should be made cheaper. As a result of pleas from assistance from consumers, the government sets the maximum price for a book at $2 a book. As a result of setting the price at $2 per book, consumers will demand Q sub D books, 40 books, but publishers will only want to supply Q sub S, or 20 books. The result is that there will be a shortage of books in this market, and some individuals will not be able to have a book to read. Summary. At each point where the supply and the demand curve cross each other is called the equilibrium point. At the equilibrium point, the supply of a good is equal to the demand for a good. The equilibrium point will give an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. Disequilibrium is any point on the graph where the supply curve and the demand curve do not cross each other. Any point where the supply of goods exceeds the demand for a good is called a surplus. Any point where the demand for a good exceeds the supply of a good is called a shortage. If the government sets a price above the equilibrium price, the government has set a price floor. That is, the price is not allowed to fall below the price set by the government. A price floor will create a surplus of the good because firms will supply more of the good than individuals want. If the government sets a price below the equilibrium price, the government has set a price ceiling. This price is not allowed to increase above the price set by the government. A price ceiling will create a shortage of the good because individuals will demand more of the good than firms are willing to supply.